Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up, we have Trojan Horse, 4 mana 0/4 paladin minion with the battle cry, give this minion to your opponent, and the death rattle, fill your opponent's board with silver hand recruits. So this card is similar to Marin the Fox in that you're giving your opponent a 0 attack minion that you then want to destroy to reap a board full of silver hand recruits. Now, 4 mana for a 0/4 is slow, but 4 mana to give your opponent a 4/4? Come on. The reward, on the other hand, is pretty crazy value, getting you up to 7 silver hand recruits to fill up your board. 4 mana for 7/7 stats? Methinks conspiracy. Ben Brode? And the fact that these are silver hand recruits is also pretty powerful. Level Up, Crystal Lion, Lightfuse Stegodon, we all know that there are some powerful synergies. But my favorite part about this card is the interaction between both players. You can play this and destroy on the same turn to get the silver hand recruits right away. But with Paladin's limited single target removal, sometimes this is going to be left out during your opponent's turn. And now they have a new minion on the board to deal with. They could take advantage of the new body and find lethal with something like Savage Roar. Maybe they want to try to prolong your reward, so they buff the horse or put taunts in the way. Or maybe they want to deal with the situation before you can buff the guys with a silence, or by killing the horse off and using a cheap board clear right away. Not only is it a unique experience giving your opponent a minion punching bag, but it's also going to change your opponent's game plan when they tab back into the game to see a horse on their side of the field. Balance-wise, this is a bit of an oddball card. I suppose I could see it working in an even paladin, but it's expensive up front, and it may be too slow for any of the competitive silver hand paladin decks. Spending 4 mana to do nothing is rough, and the card actually costs more because you also need to allocate 4 damage to kill the horse. And if you don't get the death rattle on that same turn you play it, you always risk the card getting you nothing, or even helping your opponent out. I'm also not 100% sure about how this card interacts when your opponent has a full board, but my guess is that the battle cry wouldn't activate and it would just stay on your side of the board. This means you gotta be careful not to play this when your opponent has a full board. Trojan Horse has a unique design and great flavor. It totally works in Paladin, and I love the idea of a bunch of little dudes hiding inside of your opponent's horse. It could end up being too slow for the Paladin decks we have right now, but I still think it's a fun card that would be a welcomed addition to the game. Next up, we have Fel Knowledge, 1 mana warlock spell that reads, discover a spell. If you have 15 or less health, discover a priest spell instead. So just to clarify, when you're above 15 health, you'll discover a spell from your class, which is most likely warlock, unless you're playing a different class that somehow got the spell. And like the card says, if you're 15 or below, you discover a priest spell. The idea behind this card is great. You can get your class spell when you're doing alright with health, but once you're starting to hurt, you can discover a priest spell that may be able to clear the enemy board, or heal you back into a safer health total. The idea of using your health as a determinant for discovering spells from 2 different polarizing classes is a really novel idea. But in practice, this card would have a lot of issues. First off, discovering a priest spell does not mean getting heal. Priest has spells that deal damage to the enemy face, resummon minions, or give minions extra arms. Even when you're able to choose between 3 random spells, a decent amount of the time, this isn't going to land you any heal. Part of the fun in the below 15 health requirement in Warlock is that you need to include some heal into the deck in order to stay out of the danger zone. Some comments below the post were saying that maybe you could have it discover healing spells instead of priest, but I think it's fine as it is, as long as you know that there's no guarantee of heal with this card. With that said, it's a 1 mana card. You know I have problems with 1 mana cards because there's a very slim chance that anything besides aggro will play them. Discovering a spell for 1 mana is pretty decent value, but spending one of the 30 card slots on this card is a big no-no, especially when you could choose to instead play a card with much more consistent value. I don't even know if aggro would want to use this, but if they did, I'm sure they'd get Mind Blast for lethal every time. Not all card designs have to be competitive or game-ready material right away. Fel Knowledge is a good example of an idea that after a few more iterations could make a really great and unique card for the game. Maybe with some more value and cost added, and a bit less RNG too, it could be a great card in a slower deck. Next up, we have Leviathan the Tidehunter, 6 mana 3/5 Shaman Murloc with Taunt, and the battle cry, freeze all other characters, and gain +1 health for each frozen character. How could I not include this card? It's Shaman, it's a Murloc, and it's supporting Freeze Shaman. We all know that Freeze Shaman is barely an archetype, but this is great value with Marabi, and pretty good with Icebreaker too. I mean, the fact that this freezes both heroes as well makes me think that it's pretty easy to get this up to a 310 with just a few other minions out on the board. And these days boards are pretty full, so freezing the entire board to get this up to a 315 isn't unrealistic. In addition, freezing the entire board is also a great way of slowing the game down. This card is good enough that it doesn't really need any freeze or Murloc synergies, and if Shaman had any decks worth playing now, this could almost be an auto-include. I mean, what would this episode be if it didn't have a Freeze Shaman or Murloc card? Glad I could check both off with Leviathan. Next up, we have Frock, the Forgotten Mage. 4-mana mage hero card that gives your hero +1 spell damage permanently, grants you 5 armor, and gives you the new hero power, Magical Touch. 2 mana, deal 0 damage, but improved by spell damage. And because of the spell damage your hero gets from this hero card, it means that the hero power basically starts out by dealing 1 damage. Oh my god, if Blizzard doesn't print more improved by spell damage cards in this next expansion, then I'm gonna freak. I've been gushing over the possibilities of this archetype, and I think a solid card like Frock could really be the glue to make this deck more consistent. I like how it's a relatively low power level hero card, but it gets you a ton of value from your other cards. Board clears from something small like Shooting Star or big like Flame Strike are just automatically better with this +1 spell damage. Almost to the point where you could say that dealing 6 damage for 1 mana is pretty overpowered. And stacking even more minions with spell damage onto this effect would be great. Not only are you able to buff improvable cards, but you also beef up your own hero power at the same time. The difference between summoning 2 2-mana minions and 2 3-mana minions is a lot, and improving your hero power to instead deal 2 or 3 damage is also great value when you can aim it at specific targets. So I would love Frock as a way to basically beef up all improvable cards to make a more competitive spell damage mage deck. But this card has its issues. First of all, in order to get value from this card, you need to draw it first. To make any good deck, you need good cards and consistency. And while I feel like Frock would make all the other cards in this deck better, it still needs to be drawn early enough so that you can buff these other cards and get more value from them. This is kind of the rut Dr. Boom Mech Warrior is in, because if the mechs had rushed the entire game, the deck would be competitive. Instead, you have to try to draw this hero card that will, in return, make the rest of your deck better. And so while I think Frock is powerful, it's not consistent, and that's not going to help the deck win in the long term. But I suppose Frock could see play in an improvable spell damage deck, if you consider an aggressive tempo mage one of them. I fear that an aggro or tempo deck would take advantage of Frock, but instead of using them on the unique improvable spell damage cards, they would use it on spells just to smork. They could throw it in their deck, and if they get lucky, play it on turn 4, buff all of their spells, and then go face or clear the board. They wouldn't need the card to win, but just like the 2-mana Prince, it would increase their odds of winning when they drew it. So, Frock the Forgotten Mage is a tough card to evaluate. It seems like just the right stability to bring an improved by spell damage mage into the competitive scene. It's creative, it seems like it would promote interesting gameplay, and it's kind of adorable looking. At the same time, it's inconsistent because it needs to be drawn, and I fear fast decks could abuse this card. I don't know the best way to fix this card's issues, but let me know your ideas down below. And last up, we have Shadow Word Gluttony, 8-mana mage spell that reads, your opponent draws cards equal to your hand size. Hoo-wee! This would be a mean card. Basically, if you play this spell, and let's say you have 8 cards in your hand, then your opponent draws 8 cards. Let's say they already have 7 cards in their hand, then they'll draw 3 cards and proceed to burn 5 more that turn and then 1 more at the beginning of their turn. So it may seem weird to pay 8 mana to give your opponent draw value, but if you're able to burn a decent amount of cards, maybe even a combo piece, then it's a super powerful play. So this card is pretty situational. Obviously it's terrible against aggro, so the card's really only for matchups against slower, combo, or control decks. Usually, opponents playing these decks will have a decent number of cards in hand, which means unless they see this card coming, it could burn a lot of cards. Still, this card costs 8 mana, which is basically your entire turn, and it requires that you have a decent hand size as well. Even though this card is pretty hard to use, I think the design's biggest downfall is it's just kind of a dick move. As much as I dislike Hadronox and the combos that you just can't outvalue, I think this card takes less skill and planning to basically just shit on someone's game plan and ruin their game. It's definitely a high risk, high reward card, but it's all based off of what matchups you're queued into, when you draw the spell, and when your opponent draws their combo pieces. I suppose you could argue that I basically just defined the randomness of any Hearthstone game, but it's not like this card solves that issue. Shadow Word Gluttony is a great concept for a card. It takes the value of card draw to the extreme, to a point where you can actually use it to hurt your opponent. At the same time, I think it promotes the exact unsportsmanlike gameplay it was created to combat. Printing this card just doesn't feel like the moral way to win this fight. I'm sure if I had just lost another game to Taunt Druid, I'd be praising this card's balance, but I think this card is just too ridiculous to include into the game. Also, I will be holding group meetings for post-Druid trauma survivors in my office, if you feel like you need some support. That is all for this week's top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. Thank you to the Custom Hearthstone subreddit and to all of the card creators. Let me know what you all thought about this episode and any recommendations on the style or format. I'll be back next week with another episode, but until then, ta-ta.